A warm welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on the Global Hydrogen Review 2026. My name is Uwe Remmer. I'm head of the Hydrogen and Alternative Fuels Unit here at the IEA, and I'm very much delighted to have you with us today. I'm also joined by my colleagues, the lead authors of this year's edition of the Global Hydrogen Review, which will present just in a moment the key findings of this year's report. If we look at the energy sector these days, and also, of course, the hydrogen sector, it's hard not to talk about the crisis or conflict in the Middle East these days. The Middle East is not only central to global oil and gas markets, it's also a major producer and exporter of hydrogen-based products like ammonia, like urea, like methanol. And the disruptions that we have seen during the conflict, of course, also have contributed to supply shortages, price uncertainty or price volatility, supply uncertainty across global markets for chemicals, refined products, and of course also fertilizers. If one looks at alternatives or solutions, renewable hydrogen is not an immediate solution measure in the current crisis, but in the longer term, it can play an important role to improve energy security or strengthening energy security, for example, by reducing the import dependency on hydrogen-based products, also to reduce the import dependency on natural gas being used to produce, for example, ammonia, methanol, or fertilizers. But scaling up will take time for renewable hydrogen. And the low-emission hydrogen sector actually is entering or has entered a phase of consolidation. After a wave of project announcements at the beginning of this decade for low-emission hydrogen production, we're actually seeing now for the second year in a row a decline in the potential production from announced projects for low-emission hydrogen production by 2030. Actually, the decline that we've identified or seen last year was again around a quarter decline in the total product pipeline for low-emission hydrogen production, and we already seen in the year before a similar decline by around a quarter in the product pipeline. But the encouraging news is, if we have a closer look at the data that my colleagues will present today, we actually see a more nuanced picture when it comes to low-emission hydrogen production, or generally the low-emission hydrogen production projects. Despite the challenges, the sector continues to make significant progress. Global installed electrolyzer capacity actually has doubled in 2025, reaching more than 4 gigawatts. The addition of around 2 gigawatts in 2025 is actually the largest addition on record that we've seen so far. Also, investment in low-emission hydrogen production projects is estimated to have reached almost $7 billion last year, nearly twice the level recorded in 2024. This year's spending is expected to reach or to grow by 50%, reaching then more than $10 billion based on the announced projects or the product pipeline so far. There are also encouraging signs on the policy side in the European Union. After a slow start, we see actually that member states are implementing the RED III requirements for the use of renewable fuels of non-biological origin, or short RFMBOs, in transport and industry. And if you look beyond Europe, you also see, for example, more recently that China introduced for the first time a renewable hydrogen target in its 5-year plan, aiming to produce 2 million tons of renewable hydrogen by 2030. This year's Global Hydrogen Review has a regional focus or special focus on Africa. Nearly 600 million people across the continent still lack access to electricity. Energy demand remains low, and electricity grids are underdeveloped. Hydrogen development must therefore be aligned with wider development goals of the continent. It should not compete with electricity access or other priorities. Instead, done well, it can help to mobilize finance for projects. It can help to expand infrastructure and also can help to support industrialization. Fertilizers, for example, illustrate this potential. Africa uses so far less fertilizers than the global average, and many African countries remain heavily dependent on imports. Actually, 35% of fertilizer imports of Africa are coming from the Middle East. Domestic production of low-emission ammonia could be an option to improve fertilizer access, reduce exposure to supply risk and price volatility, and also help to increase food production. The report is again also complemented by updated project databases for low emission hydrogen production and infrastructure projects. The production database, for example, covers now almost 3,000 projects. It's actually 3 times the number included in the database that accompanied the first edition of the Global Hydrogen Review in 2021. Both databases are freely available on our website. We've also updated and expanded our online hydrogen tracker. New features include, for example, data on offtake agreements and also analysis on the production costs of ammonia and synthetic kerosene. Just a few practical points before we dwell into the presentation of this year's Global Hydrogen Review. Just to mention, the presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So please submit your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom. The webinar will also be recorded, and we will make available the recording and the slides later on our website. I will now hand it over to my colleague, José Bermúdez, to start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Uwe, and welcome everybody to this webinar. Over the next 40 minutes, we will drive you through the main findings of the report. We will start with a short introduction to provide a snapshot of the status of the hydrogen sector and how the conflict in the Middle East has affected supply chains for hydrogen-based products. Then we will go through some of the developments on low emissions hydrogen production, including revisions to the project pipeline to 2030. We will continue with the demand side, covering offtake agreements, and also a special chapter we had this year on the cost of the different sectors and regions can pay for hydrogen. We will go through the split of the public funding in policies that made progress since the Global Hydrogen Review 2025, and we will end with the main findings of the regional focus chapter that this year we have dedicated to Africa. So starting with a bit of context, global hydrogen production and use continues to grow. It actually exceeded in 2025 for the first time 100 million tons. With this growth driven primarily by established industrial sectors where hydrogen is used as a feedstock rather than by policies to promote its adoption, to reduce emissions and enhance energy security. But the crisis in the Middle East has also exposed the vulnerabilities of global value chains for hydrogen-based products. The Middle East is today an oil refining hub. It is home to more than 10% of global refining capacity, and it is a major producer of hydrogen-based products, accounting for more than 10% of global ammonia production and urea production, and close to 20% of methanol production. It also plays a major role in international trade, representing over a quarter of global ammonia trade, almost 40% of global urea trade, and nearly 45% of methanol trade. Moreover, the Middle East is one of the fastest growing regions, with the production and use of hydrogen nearly doubling between 2015 and 2025. So disruptions to refineries and petrochemical plants caused by supply constraints, export limitations, and in some cases direct damage due to military attacks are therefore having global consequences which extend beyond the region itself. For example, in Asia, countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, or India depend heavily on importing natural gas from the Middle East, with around 1/4 of their ammonia production relying on gas from this region. The disruptions seen during the conflict have contributed to shortages, supply uncertainty, and price volatility across global markets for refined products, for chemicals, and particularly for fertilizers. Fertilizer production costs have been highly volatile worldwide. Urea prices doubled between January and May 2026, reflecting supply disruptions, higher natural gas prices, and export restrictions by major suppliers. Prices went down to pre-conflict levels in June, underpinned by the interim agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, but their future evolution remains highly uncertain. This has direct implications for food supply chains. Fertilizers are essential for crop yields, and even modest reductions in their use can affect agricultural output. The risk is especially high for countries that depend on imports, as it is illustrated in the map. For urea, for example, countries such as Brazil, Australia, South Africa, and Thailand are fully import dependent, and up to 70% of their ammonia and urea domestic demand is met with imports specifically from the Middle East. The adoption of low emissions hydrogen can help in improving the resilience of supply chains for hydrogen-based products against these type of vulnerabilities. It can also strengthen energy security by reducing dependence on imported hydrogen-based products, such as ammonia and urea, and on imported natural gas used to produce hydrogen for fertilizers, chemicals, and refining. However, low emissions hydrogen and hydrogen-based products are not ready to be a solution for the current crisis. Current and committed production remains small and is not enough to respond immediately to today's market pressures. While several large projects are expected before 2030, a significant contribution to energy security will require much greater scale and will require much more time. Therefore, low emissions hydrogen and hydrogen-based products can play a role in complementing long-term energy security measures. So let me now turn to the project pipeline, which is becoming more mature as developers and investors reassess what can credibly be delivered by 2030. Committed production by 2030, which we define as projects that are operational, under construction, or that have taken a final investment decision, reached 4.3 million tons. This represents a growth of only 3% compared with the estimate in the Global Hydrogen Review 2025. Moreover, the announced pipeline for 2030 has been revised downward by around 10 million tons. This reduction is primarily the result of cancellations, projects entering dormant status, and projects that have been delayed post-2030. The most common reasons for projects to be delayed, cancelled, or put on hold are persistently high technology costs in combination either with insufficient public support or challenges in meeting criteria to access this public funding to close the cost gap. These are combined with barriers for permitting and also lack of offtake, particularly due to uncertain regulatory frameworks to stimulate demand. There have been some new projects announced aiming to reach operation before the end of the decade, but they are not enough to compensate for these reductions. So consequently, we have also revised our estimation of the announced production that has a strong potential to be operational by 2030. Together with committed production, in the Global Hydrogen Review 2025, we estimated that up to 10 million tons of announced production had a strong potential to be operational by 2030, whereas in our new estimate, this has been reduced to just above 6 million tons. This reflects delays in several large-scale projects that would have required near-term investment decisions to be operational by 2030, as well as policy uncertainty in some key markets, notably in the United States. The projects with the strongest likelihood to be online by 2030 are concentrated in sectors where hydrogen already has an established market, such as refining and chemical feedstocks. Synthetic fuels are also gaining momentum thanks to growing interest in new applications such as co-firing of ammonia in power generation, particularly in Japan and more recently in China, and the maritime sector. By contrast, many projects targeting new direct hydrogen applications are less likely to be operational in the short term. So overall, the project pipeline is becoming smaller but more credible. The projects most likely to move forward are increasingly concentrated in sectors where hydrogen already has established demand, highlighting that the next phase of market development will depend not only on bringing online supply, but also on creating stronger and more predictable demand signals. So having looked at the overall hydrogen project pipeline, let us focus now on electrolysis, which remains one of the main technologies underpinning future low emissions hydrogen supply. The good news is that global installed electrolysis capacity doubled in 2025 to reach 4 gigawatts, and that investment continues to progress. There are around 30 gigawatts of electrolysis capacity that have reached final investment decision worldwide. This means that developers continue to move projects from planning into execution despite the challenging market environment. Regionally, China continues to dominate investment decisions, accounting for 2/3 of cumulative FIDs, while Europe remains as the second largest market. However, the pace of new investment decisions slowed during 2025, and new FIDs were lower than in 2024. This slowdown reflects the same factors that we discussed in the previous slide: persistently high project costs, uncertainty over future demand, lengthy permitting procedures, and delays in the implementation of support schemes. This decrease was most pronounced in China, although here we think that the decline could be temporary. A wave of new support schemes and policies announced in China to expand use of hydrogen and hydrogen-based products and hydrogen-based fuels to new sectors and reduce reliance on fossil fuel imports is expected to reinvigorate activity in the coming years. Now, looking at the sectoral breakdown, we can see that around 2/3 of all electrolysis capacity that reach final investment decision targets industrial applications, particularly ammonia production. The production of synthetic fuels represents the second largest application, reflecting growing interest in the maritime sector, mostly in China, but also the production of ammonia as an energy carrier. By contrast, projects supplying hydrogen directly to entirely new end users remain relatively limited. Developers continue to prioritize markets where demand already exists and commercial risks are lower. So overall, electrolysis deployment is continuing to advance, but at a lower pace than anticipated a year ago. Increasing manufacturing capacity is no longer the main challenge. Ensuring that projects can secure customers and reach financial close is becoming the defining issue. And speaking about manufacturing capacity, China provides a clear example of how fast the electrolyzer industry has developed, but also of the challenges that can emerge when manufacturing capacity grows faster than demand. China is now the world's largest manufacturing base for electrolyzer systems, growing from around 4 gigawatts per year of manufacturing capacity back in 2021 to around 35 gigawatts per year in 2025. This rapid expansion did not happen by accident. Looking at the composition of the Chinese electrolyzer manufacturing market, we can see that many of the companies active today entered the market after 2021. This is the result of industrial policies introduced in early 2020s, including the 14th five-year plan, the subsequent hydrogen industry development plan, and several ambitious regional initiatives. These policies encourage companies to enter the hydrogen equipment market and supported the creation of domestic supply chains. This attracted not only hydrogen specialized companies, but also firms from adjacent sectors such as heavy industry, chemicals, renewable technologies, and fuel cells manufacturing. However, and despite the rapid growth in annual additions for installed electrolysis capacity, the speed at which these installations have grown has not been able to match the expansion in manufacturing capacity, and demand from overseas markets have not ramped up yet. As a consequence, the actual production of these manufacturing facilities is much lower than their capacity, at less than 2 gigawatts in 2025. Moreover, fewer than 1/3 of Chinese electrolyzer manufacturers secured orders in 2025. This has created a situation in which a large share of capacity remains underutilized. Chinese companies are undergoing a very intense competition for a limited pool of projects, leading often to cuts in prices rather than improving profitability. This has helped reduce electrolyzer prices, but it has also created risks. If prices fall below sustainable levels, manufacturers may struggle to recover their investments, maintain their product quality, and continue funding innovation. We're already seeing some signs that the industry is trying to respond to the situation, and leading Chinese manufacturers are looking for export markets and international partnerships. So to sum up, China is driving global electrolyzer cost reduction, but the sector is entering a more difficult phase. Manufacturing scale has been achieved, but the challenge is now to create enough demand, ensure quality, and avoid a disorderly consolidation of the industry. And with that, I will pass to my colleague, Erin.
Thanks a lot, Jose. So now let's transition to the demand side. Demand creation remains one of the biggest challenges for the low emissions hydrogen sector, and this is reflected in the evolution of the offtake agreements. In 2025, as we see in the slide, around 1.7 million tons per year of hydrogen equivalent were covered by newly signed offtake agreements. This was nearly the same as 2024 and remained well below the 2023 peak of nearly 2.5 million tons. However, the quality of these agreements matters as much as the volume. Only around 1/5 of the new agreements signed in 2025 were firm offtake agreements. This includes binding contractual commitments between buyers and suppliers, and therefore provides the certainty needed to unlock investment decisions. Looking specifically at these firm agreements, in 2025, they were concentrated in three sectors: refining, power generation, and industry. In refining, most of the agreements were signed in Europe, suggesting that the implementation of the Renewable Energy Directive is beginning to create real demand signals. In power generation, the largest agreements were linked to ammonia imports into Japan, supported by the country's Contracts for Difference scheme and preferential financing. And in industry, major agreements were associated with ammonia production in India and low emissions iron production in Oman. Another important milestone is that for the first time, trade-oriented agreements accounted for a larger share of firm offtakes than those agreements for domestic use. Around 2/3 of the firm offtake volumes were linked to international trade, mostly for ammonia exports for power generation in Japan and fertilizer production in Europe. This is an early indication that policy frameworks such as Japan's support for hydrogen supply chain and Europe's carbon pricing, including the carbon border adjustment mechanism, are starting to translate into real commercial activity. The overall message is therefore mixed. Demand is developing and international trade is beginning to take shape, but the volume of firm offtake agreements remains far below what is needed to support the scale of the announced production pipeline. This year, we also had a special chapter on the cost acceptability of different hydrogen applications and how much each of these applications could pay for hydrogen based on their current cost structure and considering the effect of policies. First, let me explain the concept before going into the results and insights. With a gas price similar to the 2025 level, ammonia production from steam reforming in Europe has a cost of about $600 per ton. About 1/3 of this comes from non-feedstock costs, like the capex of the synthesis unit, fixed OPEX, or energy for compression. 2/3 are from the natural gas used as feedstock and for heat supply. In 2035, the renewable route could still be nearly 2/3 more expensive than the incumbent route, with this difference being driven by the more expensive feedstock due to the higher cost of electricity. Given the global nature of some of these commodities, there's competitive pressure to keep the same prices. An incumbent producer would have incentives to keep paying the same costs for the hydrogen as they do now. If that were the case, then it means that they can only pay, in this example that I'm showing, $375 per ton for the hydrogen, leaving a cost gap with the full renewable hydrogen cost. This comparison can also be affected by policies that increase the cost of the incumbent route. This could be like carbon pricing or quotas with penalties. In this example, policy increases the maximum acceptable hydrogen cost to around $560 per ton. The cost gap can also be affected by policies that decrease the cost of the low emissions route, but that will not affect the cost acceptability of the end use. This analysis therefore focuses on the demand side, and the maximum acceptable hydrogen cost is what can be spent on the hydrogen feedstock in a low emissions pathway without exceeding the levelized cost of producing the final commodity with the incumbent pathway. We did this analysis for 5 regions: China, the European Union, India, Japan, and North America. In North America, energy costs are lower, which means the incumbent route has lower costs, and the maximum acceptable hydrogen cost is also lower. In China, the incumbent route is gasification, which has higher costs associated to the hydrogen feedstock. At the same time, China also produces the cheapest renewable hydrogen in the world, which means by 2035, the cost gap could already be closed. In the analysis, we cover 6 hydrogen applications. When we compare the maximum acceptable hydrogen cost with the cheapest renewable hydrogen production, in this case for the EU, that's the green line, we see first that all the red circles are below $2 per kilogram. This highlights the limited cost allowance that could be spent on hydrogen based on the current cost structure for these sectors. Second, there are some negative values, notably steel. This is because all the non-feedstock costs are higher for the hydrogen route. This means that not even with free hydrogen, cost parity with incumbent route would be reached. Third is that the gap with the production cost is not closed. When extending this to other regions, ammonia and refining are the applications with the highest maximum acceptable cost. These are industrial uses where hydrogen is already used today and that are the least penalized for additional costs when shifting to low emissions hydrogen. Only China closes the gap by 2035 for some of the applications, and further policy support is needed in other regions. One of the policies that could have the most widespread support across hydrogen application is carbon pricing. In 2025, carbon pricing covered 29% of global greenhouse gas emissions with an average price of $21 per ton of CO2. If that were to reach $150 per ton of CO2, it could have a significant impact on the maximum acceptable cost. This effect is dependent on specific CO2 emissions of each sector, the specific hydrogen consumption, and the cost structure, including the share of energy costs. One of the most impacted is the steel sector, which has the lowest share of energy costs and could shift to a maximum acceptable hydrogen cost above $2 per kilogram across all regions. In contrast, for example, aviation and shipping are the least impacted because of the lower hydrogen consumption per ton of product, despite the high CO2 emissions. The effect is linear. And if the carbon price was lower, the additional costs would change proportionally. There are also other policies that could change these values. For example, the quotas from the Renewable Energy Directive, Refuel EU, and Fuel EU Maritime in the European Union could significantly increase the maximum acceptable hydrogen costs, while also creating demand certainty. We have also included the tax credits for industry and aviation in Japan. What we're not showing here is the volume of low emissions hydrogen that could be used in each of these applications and regions. For example, Refuel EU increases significantly the maximum acceptable hydrogen costs, as we see here in the figure, in the gray circle, but the demand that could be triggered by this regulation is around 250 kilotons, which is relatively small. You can find in the report these demand cost curves by region with the volume component. The overall message is that there are some bright spots. That means China and ammonia and refining, for example, but further policy support is needed in most applications to close the gap with the production costs. Carbon pricing can go a long way in supporting uptake, but it is not the only tool. Now let's move on to policy support. In the past year, policies representing over $41 billion of public funding have made progress in the policy process from announcement to award. This is nearly 10% higher than the previous GHR edition and almost 4 times the investment we estimate there will be on hydrogen production this year. This is not all the same at the same level of maturity. Only about a quarter has been actually disbursed to projects, and more than half does not yet have a specific cost for projects associated. We can draw different insights when splitting this funding in different ways. By type of economy, almost 95% of the funding came from advanced economies. This is similar to the last edition and reflects the choice of policy instruments, where land allocation, tax incentives, and reduced administrative processes remain more common among emerging markets. The split is also different than the picture that hydrogen strategies depict, where there's nearly a 50-50 split. In terms of the supply chain, the supply side still receives more support, equal to about $1.5 for every dollar targeting demand. Yet this is more balanced than the government targets, where supply targets add up to nearly 3 times demand. Some of the largest funding includes the Contracts for Difference scheme in Italy, which is expected to support 200 kilotons of renewable hydrogen, and the European Hydrogen Bank, where the grant agreements were signed for the second round and winners of the third round were announced. The share of funding from policies that have been implemented is now almost 70%, similar to the previous edition. Some of the largest enforced policies are the important projects of common European interest, supported by Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain, and the approval of the construction of hydrogen pipelines in Denmark. The demand side represented about $13 billion, including the city clusters pilot program in China, with approximately $1.1 billion in support, expanding hydrogen deployment beyond road transport and sectors such as ammonia, methanol, steel, and industrial heating. Another example is the 660 million euros from the Netherlands for hydrogen use in industrial applications. Public funding has already supported FIDs, renewable hydrogen projects in Austria and Spain, hydrogen from fossil fuels in the United States, and an electrolyzer manufacturing plant in Norway. However, public support is up to 60% of the cost in some of these examples, which is not economically sustainable, and that is why a holistic support, including demand creation and certification, is needed. Now Male will guide us through some of the highlights for Africa.
Yes, and as we mentioned, this year, regional focus of the Global Hydrogen Review is in Africa. Africa is home to almost 20% of the world's population. Nevertheless, it accounts to just over 5% of global energy consumption. And what is most strikingly, nearly 600 million people still lack access to electricity. So there are some energy access challenges that need to remain at the front and center when considering Africa's hydrogen potential. Because hydrogen development could, in fact, compete for scarce electricity and infrastructure if it's not carefully planned. But if designed well, it could also support broader energy and development objectives. For example, helping to catalyze investments in power grids and in other enabling infrastructure such as water desalination, gas infrastructure. Therefore, hydrogen strategies and ambitions need to be closely integrated with broader energy sector planning and development objectives in the continent. And when we look into where hydrogen is today in the continent, hydrogen demand in Africa reached around 3 million tons in 2024. This is approximately 3% of the global demand. So it plays a relatively smaller share in the global demand of hydrogen. Nevertheless, this is a 50% increase over the past decades. Demand is highly concentrated in a few countries, particularly Egypt accounts for around half of the total demand, followed by Algeria and Nigeria. And ammonia production represents nearly 3/4 of the hydrogen demand across the continent. But when we think about the future of hydrogen in Africa, we think about the possibilities it offers to the continent for industrial development and for improving the trade balance. So let's look into two of the products that are most affected by hydrogen. And I will start with the bottom, with steel. So actually, steel will offer a possibility to move up in the value chains for African countries. Nevertheless, if we look to the trade balance, actually you will see in steel inputs, this is iron ore exports. Africa is a net exporter. Nevertheless, exports and revenues from exports are very much concentrated, mainly in South Africa and to a lesser extent in Mauritania and Liberia. But when we look into higher added value products, looking at the steel products, Africa is by far a net importer. There are only two countries, South Africa and Egypt, that are net exporters. So this opens up a possibility, and particularly this possibility it is because also 80% of the iron making capacity in Africa is based on direct reduced iron, also known as DRA, as opposed to the global level where DRA is approximately 20%. So hydrogen could already be used to partially or fully displace natural gas with some amendments. And in fact, some of the new plants that are being built or that have recently started operation in North Africa, in Algeria, in Libya, are being designed from the outset as hydrogen ready and can handle higher shares of hydrogen blending already. When we look into the nitrogen fertilizers, we can see that Africa is a net exporter. Nevertheless, production is very much concentrated. So despite being a net exporter, most of the African countries do not produce any ammonia, so rely completely on imports. And let's deep dive a bit into this. Africa produces nearly 6% of the global ammonia. Nevertheless, it only uses 4% of the global nitrogen fertilizers. But it accounts for almost 20% of the global cropland. So these gaps matters because actually this means that the fertilizer used across the continent is around 1/5 of the global average. And this has consequence, and Africa has some of the lowest crop yields worldwide. And this adds to an import dependence on food. And actually, for example, in 2024, the continent's food trade deficit reached more than $22 billion, which is more than 1% of the GDP. In addition, because despite the fact that some particularly North African countries are net exporters of ammonia, 48 out of the 54 African countries rely entirely on imports. The largest trading partner is intra-African trade, but despite that, the second largest trading partner is the Middle East. It provided 35% of the ammonia and ammonia-derived fertilizer needs to the continent in 2024, but in some countries, this was up to 80%. So this leaves a lot of countries exposed not only to international price spikes and fluctuations, but also to potential supply disruptions, as we have seen. So in 2024, because of this reason, African Union member states adopt an action plan, and this action plan aims to triple fertilizer use by 2034, and at the same time expand domestic manufacturing. Meeting these goals, the goals from the African Union Action Plan, will imply an increase in ammonia demand of around 8 million tons, we estimate, and these 8 million tons will require around 1.5 million tons of hydrogen. If this hydrogen were to be produced from natural gas, it will consume around 7 billion cubic meters of natural gas, and this is less than 3% of Africa's current production. Nevertheless, producing it through electrolysis will require around 40 gigawatts of renewable capacity, and this is a challenge because it's slightly more than the continent's current combined wind and solar capacity. This need of nitrogen fertilizers demand in the continent is already starting to be translated into actual projects. There are new plants under construction in Nigeria that will use natural gas, but also there are a lot of renewable hydrogen project announcements, and more than 1 million tons by 2030, and actually a lot of these projects target ammonia. Nevertheless, less than 3% of these projects had a final investment decision, which means that projects in Africa are moving slower than in the rest of the world. But there is no doubt that expanding domestic fertilizer production in the continent could strengthen energy, but also food security, reducing exposure to global price volatility and supporting broader industrial development. And we think it is possible because Africa has vast resources. And let's look first into natural gas. The continent currently produces around 6% of the world's natural gas. It consumes around 4%, and most of this consumption relates a lot to power and not actually to industrial activities that could add value. And if we look into the reserves, Africa actually holds 8% of the global reserves of natural gas. So this leaves us some room for increasing hydrogen production from natural gas. So if we consider that if Africa will increase gas production to align with its reserves and will increase the amount of natural gas it uses for hydrogen, it could double the hydrogen production it has today that could use, for example, for ammonia or for iron. And we also need to highlight that Africa flares quite a lot of natural gas. It's responsible for around 20% of the world's natural gas flaring. So if we assume that it could reduce 50% of this natural gas flaring, and therefore this natural gas could now be available and increase the domestic natural gas production in the continent, hydrogen production could even triple, reaching 10 million tons. And also, gas production in the continent is becoming much more geographically diverse. Major resources have traditionally been concentrated in Algeria, Egypt, and Nigeria. Nevertheless, there are new discoveries and new plants that have started in operation in Mozambique, Tanzania, and offshore in Senegal and Mauritania. And this could create opportunities for new countries to develop domestic industry rather than just relying on natural gas, on LNG exports. When we look into renewable resource, Africa also has vast high-quality renewable resource, yet renewable hydrogen production costs remain relatively high in the continent, and this is mostly because of the high cost of capital that actually offsets the advantage from excellent solar and wind resource. The lowest cost could be achieved in Morocco because it combines both excellent renewable resource with relatively lower cost of capital. However, the cost of capital, the financing cost, can be reduced. It requires a combination of financial instrument, risk mitigation tools, credit enhancement, but financial instruments are not alone are not enough. It also needs to create a strong enabling environment, particularly predictable energy and industrial policies. And with that, I would like to conclude with 5 key policy recommendations that emerged from this year's analysis. First, governments should consider to review their 2030 targets and develop longer-term ambitions that reflect actual market developments, technology progress, and evolving demand signals. These ambitions should be supported by specific measures and faster implementation. Governments should also consider the integration of hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels in broader long-term energy security plans. Second, governments should accelerate policy implementation on the demand side. The demand remains today the main bottleneck, and creating clear markets for low emissions hydrogen in sectors that are already established, such as refining and industry, is essential. Third, we still need support in the production side because there is a cost gap that should be closed. Particularly in the near term, it's very likely that low emissions hydrogen remains more costly than hydrogen production through unabated fossil fuels pathways. Fourth, we have the challenge with infrastructure that is not there to connect production and demand and has very long lead times, so its development must be accelerated. And last, as we have seen, the cost of capital can offset any potential advantage from excellent renewable resource. The cost of capital has an impact of nearly 50% on the levelized cost of hydrogen. So a lot of emerging economies will need support, and particularly the role of international finance institutions to help them decrease this finance cost and realize their actual potential. And before finalizing, I would like to remind you that in addition to the report, this year we have published an updated version of the IEA's Hydrogen Tracker, which is available in the website, and it includes much more information than what we have in the report on what we have been able to convey here today. And you can see that the tracker presents an updated map with all the projects, low emissions hydrogen projects that have been announced around the world, and you can click and see more information. It also has information on the low emissions hydrogen production, historical values and capacity, and also on infrastructure. You can drop down in the list and select specifically by location. On the demand side, this year, as a novelty, we also include a lot of information on offtake agreements. You can click and select. We also have information on the hydrogen production costs, with also regional disaggregation. And this year, we not only include hydrogen, but we have integrated production costs for ammonia and synthetic kerosenes that you can have a look at it. And finally, we have the policy dashboard that has more than 1,000 policies that have been announced or implemented since 2020 and have different types of policies that support, in a way, hydrogen development. We think it's a very valuable source of information for you, and I can only encourage you to visit our website and to visit our hydrogen tracker. And with that, back to you, Uwe.
Thank you very much, Amalia. This brings us to the end of the presentation of the Global Hydrogen Review. I know we've got some time to address the questions that you have to the report. So thank you very much already for the questions that you submitted in the Q&A feature of Zoom. Please continue to do so. So let me start with one question for you, see on the role of hydrogen or the linkage of hydrogen biofuel production, because I guess this year we added for the first time also a short section on it in the refining section. So please, you see.
Yeah, thank you very much, Uwe. Yeah, indeed, this year, for the first time, we have covered in a bit more detail the demand for hydrogen in the production of biofuels, because actually among what we consider new hydrogen applications, it is so those excluding the traditional uses of hydrogen in refining and in the industrial sector. The demand for hydrogen in the production of biofuels is the largest demand on these new applications, and it accounts for today around 75% of demand for hydrogen in these new applications, and is expected to remain the largest demand by 2030, although the share will be smaller because other sectors, other applications catching up. So demand for liquid biofuels have been growing strongly in the last few years. So they already met around 4% of energy demand in the transport sector. And this share is expected to grow actually by 20% in 2030. And roughly 15% of biofuels demand is met with hydrotreated vegetable oils of HVOs and hydroprocessed ester and fatty acids or HEFAs. And these two biofuels require quite a significant amount of hydrogen in the production. Moreover, the processing of biological feedstocks is more intensive in hydrogen use than the processing of fossil-based feedstock. They require between 5 and 15 times more of hydrogen per unit of processed feedstock. So consequently, the demand for hydrogen biofuels production is growing fast, and actually we estimate that it can double between 2024 and 2030. So it's definitely an important new demand, still way lower than the traditional applications in refining and in industry, but it's definitely an important new area of demand for hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Jose. There's another question we touched already before on the topic of the transposition of the RED III requirements into national law. There was a question related, what's the role of the refinery route, which kind of is an option for the transport target. Maybe, Harry, can you say a few words on what's the status there?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. So yeah, the refinery route facilitates achieving the target. The target is 1% of transport demand by 2030. And then it achieves fulfilling the target since hydrogen is already used in refineries. And also the outlook for fuel cell electric vehicles has changed since the RED was approved. Especially, in particular, the outlook for battery electric vehicles and their competitiveness. In terms of the status, so far, 14 member states out of the 27 have done the transposition. These 14 member states represent about 2/3 of the transport energy demand. And separately, 12 of the 27 member states use the refinery route as an option. That refinery route has already triggered some FIDs, as we mentioned in the presentation. There have been some firm offtake agreements triggered by that refinery route, so it is working. A bit more broadly, beyond the refinery route for the transport targets, one factor is that some countries, specifically Belgium, France, Germany, and Spain, have defined the quotas for transport beyond 2030. So that gives visibility as well for the investment. That's one general comment, and the other general one is that there's heterogeneity among member states. So there are different rules in terms of multipliers, targets, the refinery route, and so on, which might make it difficult for project developers to navigate. And lastly, something to bear in mind is the interaction of the refinery route with AFIR. So that's a regulation for alternative fuel infrastructure, which has some specific targets for refilling stations, which is linked to the demand for transport specifically and fuel cell vehicles.
Well, thank you very much, Harib. There was another question on the topic of fertilizers, and particularly also Africa. And maybe because, Amalia, you showed some of the numbers there, maybe you can shed some light where Africa is currently importing fertilizers from, and what's, let's say, overall the role of trade that we see for fertilizers.
Yes, so around 40% of the nitrogen-based fertilizers imported in Africa come from intra-African trade. This is, for example, from Nigeria. And around 35% of the demand also comes from Middle East. And to put it into context, for example, in Africa, 35% of the nitrogen-based fertilizers comes from the Middle East, while at the global level, this is less than 20%. So Africa relies more than the rest of the world for nitrogen-based fertilizer imports. And then if we want to look to the third trading partner in terms of nitrogen-based fertilizer imports, that's Russia. So these three intra-African trade, Middle East and Russia, supply approximately 80% of the nitrogen-based fertilizer needs in the country. There is also Europe that supplies ammonia. That could be the case particularly for Morocco, and they virtually supply all the nitrogen-based fertilizer demand in the African continent.
Thank you very much, Amalia. Then we had another question on this because this year we introduced a kind of new analysis regarding the cost acceptability of hydrogen that also Harry presented, and there was a specific question also on some of the results across sectors that iron and steelmaking in particular looked quite bad. Maybe you can explain a bit the reasoning or the reasons for this in our analysis, Harry, please.
Yeah, thanks again for the question. So one factor is the analysis covered mostly wind and solar, but in reality there might be some bright spots, for example, in Europe, in the Nordics, with hydropower, for example. That's one component. The other one is that there might be some willingness to pay from specific actors. So the chapter also includes an analysis on what we call private willingness to pay, which are some specific sectors. So it could be, for example, OEMs for auto manufacturers that are willing to pay a premium on the steel. And then that might trigger, might make positive the business case for specific plants. There have been also some specific support for H2 DRI plants in Germany, for example, in the form of grants, also loans in the Netherlands. That might change the economics as well. That's another component. And another way could be to pass on the cost premium downstream the value chain. So the cost premium for H2 DRI could be 20-30%, but once you pass it on to the end users, can become less than 1%, depending on the end use. So coordination and passing on the premium, that's another way of kind of making the business case more attractive. And lastly, there could be also strategic reasons to maintain the economic activity. That could be the effect on downstream sectors beyond steel itself. So that might be also, again, strategic reasons to maintain the activity. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Harib. Then we had another question related also to, electrolyzers showed up a bit in the across the questions that you submitted. There's particularly one also related to PEM electrolyzers and the use of the need for iridium. Could you maybe say something about what we see, let's say, whether there's a potential to reduce the iridium loading, or what's the kind of innovation potential we see there?
Yes, thank you. But yeah, indeed, this is a recurrent topic in terms of how fast the PEM electrolyzers can grow in the market share that they have today. So indeed, these electrolyzers require iridium, which is actually a very difficult rare earth to obtain because it's used as a byproduct of the production of other critical minerals. However, we need to be conscious of the scale up that we are seeing, in particular in the short term. We are not seeing a sector that is exploding and maybe putting in too much stress the iridium supply for PEM electrolyzers. But on top of that, we are seeing also significant innovation progress on this area, and actually I would even say much faster than what the deployment is growing. No, but we have seen, as of today, the PEM electrolyzer require around 300 kilograms of iridium per gigawatt of capacity. But there is a target within industry to reduce this to around 100 kilograms per gigawatt. So we are speaking about a third of reduction. But some companies have already announced further reductions than that. No, we have seen this year Omnium reporting to have achieved 56 kilograms per iridium per gigawatt of loading in their electrolyzers, and they are aiming for going to 30 kilograms, which will be basically reducing to 1/10 of what is today the requirement. Similar reportings also from Plug Power, and we have also been significant progress in the recycling side. So companies like Johnson Matthey and Sysenko have put together a process in which they can recover platinum, iridium, platinum group metals, which include iridium, of course, at kilogram scale. So we are seeing significant innovation developments that are expected to reduce a lot the pressure that could be if the PEM deployment scales up faster.
Thank you very much, Jussi. I fear that we've reached the end of the time that we allocated to this webinar. First of all, I would like to thank you all for your participation and also for the questions that you submitted. I realize that we did not manage to answer all of them, but if you still want to follow up on some of the questions, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we will then respond to your question. As I mentioned earlier, the recording of the webinar and also the slides will be made available on our website. So please, I guess you should hopefully receive that also soon. Once it's available, an email that you can have a look at it on our website. So yeah, thank you again for that you joined us today. We greatly appreciated your attendance, and wish you a nice or a pleasant remaining day. And thanks again for having joined us today. All the best. Bye-bye.